Okay, this is part 2 in configuring Autodeploy. We're going to get into configuring the rules. We've already configured all the Autodeploy prerequisites in the previous video. So the first thing we're going to want to do is download and install PowerCLI. I've gone ahead and done that on my vCenter. It has a couple of requirements that will also install at the same time. But it's fairly straightforward. One thing that you will get during your first launch is an error relating back to the execution policy. So that's probably an error that's an error I've already corrected, but if you do get the error, it's a pretty straightforward fix. You want to set the execution policy to be unrestricted. So to set it to be unrestricted, in my case it came up properly. If you're getting a lot of error messages here at this point, you probably haven't set your execution policy. So set execution policy unrestricted, hit enter, and just answer yes. And once you've done that, if you've done it properly, you can go to Get-EsxImageProfile. If you've ever worked, and you'll notice you're able to hit tab and it will autocomplete. And as you can see, our execution policy has been set to unrestricted. So I'm just going to go through, PowerCLI is set up. Our execution policy is set to unrestricted. We're now going to configure our local software repository, configure an initial boot rule. We're going to boot the first host. I'm going to do a very basic host profile configuration. This is just to get us up and running, and maybe at a later time I'll do a more detailed host profile configuration, because there are quite a few settings that you should be configuring when you do auto deploy a host: your syslog, crash dump, location, and various other things. There's also the authentication proxy. A lot of things that you really should consider setting up if you're going to put this into a production environment and even in a lab environment to address the constant errors that you're going to be getting if you don't have them set up. It's just easier to just go ahead and do it, and they can come in very handy when you're troubleshooting issues. Once we've got our first host booted and we've configured our host profile, we can then go and configure the final boot rules that we're going to use, and then we delete the initial boot rule. So let's get started. So I've got a list of commands that I usually use when I'm doing this, and I'm going to share that on the channel. Once you've done this a few times, you're probably going to encounter a few errors the first time you do it, and as I have, and then I'd strongly recommend you keep a text document of all the commands that you used, and you can always refer back to them when you're not sure. So the first thing we're going to want to do is just connect to our vCenter server. And essentially we're just going to execute these commands one by one until we get our repository built and we're ready to go ahead and boot our first host. So we've connected to our vCenter server. Get the standard thumbprint error. In a lab environment, you can just probably go ahead and ignore that. It's the same error that you would see if you were to connect with your vSphere client, so you get the same warning message the first time you connect until you suppress that warning. So now we're going to go ahead and connect to the VMware repository, and we're going to download a boot image. So in order to do that, we're going to take a look at the image profiles. Now, the first thing I can do is just get EsxImageProfile, and we'll get a list of all the image profiles that we can choose from. And what you'll notice is it's starting to be a bit of an overwhelming list because it's been out since Autodeploy has been out since 5.0. You can see a lot of 5.0 versions here. It's then 5.1, and now all the way up to 5.5. So you're kind of just swamped with versions. This is actually a good thing though, because in production you may not be running the most recent version of the build, and you may want to have different hosts booting different versions. You may have your lab booting 5.5, you may have your production hosts on 5.0, and you may have a QA environment or another environment that's on 5.1. But this will allow you to customize that. In our case, we want to just see the 5.5 hosts. So I'm going to run this command, Get-EsxImageProfile, and then the name, and it's going to show all the 5.5 hosts. And it's a much more manageable list. So the way to determine which one's the most recent, you can look for the last modify date, and you can also look the actual name of the image contains the date that it was released. So I'm going to go ahead and download this one, this particular one, and I know the name because I've downloaded this previously. You'll notice that they're cut off here, but you can usually guess the end. It's either standard or it's no tools. No tools means you're not going to have VMware tools as part of your ESXi image. So you're going to need to either manually install VM tools somewhere else, or you're going to have to have some other solution because you're not going to have it locally on that host when it boots. This allows the host to boot a little faster, but I just find it easier, particularly in the lab, to just go ahead and download the standard, which includes VMware tools. So I have also created a local repository here on my vCenter. I'm just going to delete them so we can start from scratch. And so I'm going to go ahead and export this from VMware's repository into my local repository that I've already created. The path is cdepot. It can take about 10-15 minutes to download, so I'll just pause the video while that happens. Okay, so the bundle has been downloaded from VMware's website. Now I'm just going to close out of PowerCLI and launch it again. And then we're going to connect to the VI server again. And now we're going to add the local depot, which we downloaded. So that's the one that we just downloaded. Now since we've already selected to go with the standard build, which includes VM tools, but that one does not include HA by default. So we're going to add that. And to do that, I'm going to run this command here. And all of these commands I'm going to include in the description of the video, so that all you need to do is modify them on your own system. So now what I'm going to do is add that depot, and you'll notice what you're connecting to here is not an external source. It's actually your own vCenter I'm connecting to in order to download that HA boot file. So next, what I'm going to do is create a new one. And the reason you do this is so that you keep your original, but you're going to create a new customized build that is just for your usage. You can call it whatever you want. I've just added the first 3 letters of my domain name in order to differentiate it. And the vendor, I've also, that's something you can use in your rules. You can enter anything you want there. If you want to configure your rules that include the vendor name, sometimes that'll come in very handy if you've got Cisco UCS or maybe Dell blades or HP blades, whatever it is you're using. You may want to have different images for each one of those. In my lab, it's just all the same, and plus we're going to be using nested hosts in order to test this. So now we're going to add that HA software package. So it's we're adding the EsxSoftwarePackage. The image profile this is going to be my customized one, and the software package we're adding is called vmware-fdm. This is the HA. This is adding HA into our custom package. Now that we've added that, we're going to export it into our depot. So we're exporting the image profile, and this is our custom one. and we're exporting it, and the file path is the same, our local depot, and it's going to be saved as standard.zip. If you're getting errors with this, you may need to add the no signature check. I'll give that a couple of minutes to complete. Okay, so now that that's done, I'm just going to close and reopen PowerCLI. Connect to our vCenter once again. Now we're going to add the local software depot that we just built. And we're going to create a new deploy rule using that particular build. Now, this can take about 10 minutes to complete. The good thing is you will see as it's running, you're going to see, actually wait, oh, just a minute. So I already have a rule called initial boot rule, which is why I'm getting that error. So I'm just going to remove that so we can continue with the demo. So that's been removed. So let's try that again. Okay, so that is done. Now I'm going to add the deploy rule. So this is going to be a catch-all rule, which catches all ESXi hosts that are attempting to boot, and that will allow me to boot my first host and then continue on configuring it once it has booted. So in order to test our rule, I'm going to boot a nested host. So I'll just come into here to workstation 10. I'm going to create a new virtual machine. Actually, I'll just go ahead and use typical. It doesn't need an OS because we're going to use Autodeploy to deploy the OS over the network. I'm going to just select Linux. Actually, oh, you can actually select vmware-ESX now. So that's a fairly new option, new to workstation 10. I'm just going to call this nested host 1 nh1. It's going to create a disk, but we don't need a disk, so we'll just go ahead and remove that right away. Oh, you can't remove it right away. That's okay though. Okay, so you can enter the MAC address here. Now, I prefer to enter the MAC address here rather than changing it each time, and so I'll just come into my console. I'll go to my reservations, go to 240 ESX1, which is the first one that we're going to attempt to boot. Grab the MAC address. Come back here to right here, right again, here. Put our MAC address in. Okay, so we've now put the MAC address that we want to use. 4 gigs of RAM looks good. Let's crank up the processors if we can to 4. So now this MAC address means it's going to get that IP address 240, and that will trigger, well, in this case it wouldn't really matter because no matter what IP address it got, it would potentially pull down an operating system. But in our case, we have configured the TFTP server with a rule, and that rule says only a particular range. So 240 to 250 are going to be forwarded to this particular boot folder and download those particular boot files. So by setting that MAC address so that it pulls 240, we ensure that it's going to hit the TFTP server and then continue to boot. So let's go back to NH1. I'm just going to quickly go to settings. We can remove this disk. We can even remove the CD-ROM, because really all it needs is memory and processors. Everything else it doesn't really need at this point. It's going to pull down the operating system over the network. So if we've configured everything correctly, we should see this boot directly into that vCenter. So let's throw the switch and see what happens. So there's the IP address that we set. It should pull the correct IP address, which is 240, which it did. As we can see, it looks to be booting. Oh, there it goes. Okay, so it's going to begin loading ESXi. So I'm going to give it a few minutes to load. It can take a little while, and once it's loaded, we should then see it in our vCenter, and we can continue configuration. Okay, so as promised, we now should see this in the vCenter. As you can see, it's called ESX1, and this is what I was talking about in the prerequisite steps. If you've configured your DHCP reservation, and you've also got your DNS entry, your DNSA records configured properly, then you should see the name. And as you can see, ESX1 is points to this IP address, 1.240, and that's why we see that here. So if all has gone well, so I'm just going to log into my vCenter now. And we can see if it's actually been pulled in correctly. It looks like we've got something here. And there it is, ESX1. So you'll notice it comes in totally blank. It doesn't have storage. It doesn't have anything at all, really. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new data center. Let's call this one Toronto. I'm going to create a new cluster. I'll call this, let's call it Nest cluster Nest 1. Turn on HA and vSphere. When I get into nesting, I think I may do a full video on nesting. There's a lot of settings that you're going to need to configure in order to make it work properly. But for the time being, that's not really the focus of this video, so I'm just going to, same with cluster settings, I may get into those in greater detail at a later time. For now, we'll just go ahead and do some basic setup. So the basic setup, I want to, let's see why I didn't like that. And then from there, we're going to drop it into our cluster. Okay, there we go. And we'll install the certificate. Okay, so let's take a look at our Word doc. Cluster location and root password, that's really the only settings that I'm going to configure on this host profile. Let's go to host profile. So I'm going to create a profile. Create a profile from existing host. That's going to be much quicker than doing it by hand. Name, I'm going to call it Nest 1. Take a few minutes to create the profile. Okay, profile is created. I'm just going to make one other configuration that I feel is a fairly important one, and that is the administrator password. We are going to configure a fixed one, and the password is going to be 5 stars. Okay, so we're now ready to boot additional ESX hosts, and we've got our cluster and setting and so on. We just need to update, create our final rules. That's the step that we're in right now we're going to configure the boot rules, and then finally we're going to delete our initial boot rule. So let's continue with that. Okay, so we're back to configuring our boot rules. So first one is, so we're going to create 3 different rules. First one is going to be image, just determining which image that we're going to boot from. Now, because we're in a lab, we only have the one image. They're all going to use this one. And so we're specifying, again, we're going with the IP range. So now, when previously the initial boot rule, it was the catch-all. No matter what was booted, it was going, no matter what the IP address was, it would have been forwarded to the TFTP server. The TFTP server would have then probably just dropped it because it wouldn't have matched the rule set on there. But that's kind of situational to my environment here. Okay, so now the next rule we're doing here is the cluster that it's going to be placed in once it boots. And as you can see, there's just a minor difference from what I had put in there originally. So through an error, let's put it in again. So I've corrected it. So the cluster name is CNest1, and the error here was it was just called CNest. So I'll try that again. So it doesn't like it. So what does it not like? Hold on just a minute. Okay, I found the mistake there. So the name of the rule is CNest. We can just for the sake of clarity, just call it CNest1. The actual item is the name of the cluster. The cluster's name is CNest1. Let's give that a try. 3rd time's a charm, hopefully. Yeah, okay, so it accepted that rule. Last one, which profile is it going to use? So let's see, what did we call our profile? We called it Nest1. So let's correct this. I'm going to still call it Nest Profile so that we know what the rule is doing, but it needs to match the name of the host profile that we've configured. So let's try that. So we've got our 3 rules. Now, if you ever want, if you're not sure where you're at, what's active, what's not, we can go to get deploy rule set. Now this is the active set. You can see the only one we have active is initial boots. If we want to get deploy rule, we can see all of our rules. So we've got all the rules that we created, which is initial boot and then these 3 ones. So we want these 3 to replace initial boot. So one by one, we're going to add the deploy rule. We're going to add image, CNest1, and Nest Profile. So let's add each of those. Okay, so let's get deploy rule set again. Now we see 4 active rules, and we don't want them competing with each other because we no longer need that initial boot. We're going to kill it. Okay, so now we should be able to boot any hosts in the range from 192.168.1.240 up to 254. We should be able to boot hosts, ESXi hosts, and it should go directly into our vCenter. So the same way we tested it before, we're going to test it again. We're going to create a new virtual machine. We are going to install the operating system later. It's going to be vmware-ESXi, and we're going to call it nested host 2. We'll go ahead and accept the creation of the disk. We're going to remove it later. Now, one cool thing that I just noticed as we were doing this is because we've selected ESX, it automatically ticks this to virtualize it. This is going to allow us to use HA. It's going to allow us to deploy virtual machines onto it. When we do the full nesting video, I'll discuss that in a little more depth. But I'm going to bring it up to 4 CPUs like the other one, 4 gigs of RAM. We're going to remove the CD-ROM because we don't need it. The network adapter, again, we're going to switch it over to bridged. We're going to go to advanced. We're going to pull. We're ready to do our second box. So we're going to go to properties, grab this MAC address, come back here, pop it in here. Need to properly separate it or it won't be recognized as a valid MAC address. Okay, we're done there. Finish. It's going to build our second host. Come down here to settings. We want to pull out the hard disk because we don't need this. We can always add it back in at a later time. And once again, we are going to throw the switch. And we will see pretty quickly if it gets the right IP address. If it gets the right one, 241 is the right one. Assuming we've done the rest of our work correctly, it should just go ahead and work. So as soon as it hands off to booting the OS, I'm going to assume it's going to boot properly into the vCenter, and I will pause the video at that time and we'll come back to it. Okay, for some reason it took 2 attempts there, but it did succeed on the second attempt. This does happen every now and then. If your vCenter is a little busy, it can sometimes, it just seems to miss the boot attempt. It's just something I've noticed. In a production environment, if you boot your entire cluster all at the same time, you can encounter this as well, where some will boot properly, some will apply the host profile properly, and some will just have a variety of issues. They'll fail at different spots. But we appear to be booting up properly now. So the real challenge now is to see, is it moved into the correct cluster automatically? Does the host profile get added automatically? And does it come out of maintenance mode properly? So let's monitor from the vCenter. It won't be there yet, but if it comes up correctly, we should see it come in here. I'm just going to pause the video for now until it is done booting. So one indication that things are going well, you can see the host profile tasks lists being applied to the hosts. So ideally everything is going well, and we should see it boot up shortly and appear in the vCenter. Just click back to the vCenter, and so the steps that you'll see when it's booting, it'll first reconnect. It'll be added into the vCenter in maintenance mode. It will apply the host profile, and once the host profile has been applied, it should exit itself out of maintenance mode. As promised, you can see it beginning to add the host back into vCenter. So as we can see, it has booted. It's got the correct name, the correct IP address. So now we're going to see if it actually comes up with the correct settings. Okay, so it did get an HA error. I'm not too worried about it. That's probably because, well, yeah, no data stores. So we did set this up as a very basic machine, and as promised, it came up basic with nothing on it. It did, however, just clear these alarms off so I can see exactly what's gone on. So they seem to be up and running, and so there it is, 2 nested hosts using Autodeploy. Let's just go back, and so that's it. Thank you for watching the video.